Hi everyone, welcome to this month's episode of Between the Pillars. Today I'm here with Grant Hurley, our Canadiana librarian, making his second appearance on Between the Pillars. Thank you for coming back, Grant.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Yes, and Grant is approaching his anniversary working here at the Fisher, and he has some material that he'd like to show us about a collection that he's been interested in recently. Would you like to tell us more about the collection?
Yeah, for sure. So I sort of stumbled across this collection. It's a bunch of materials related to the history of the telegraph, primarily in Canada, but also in the United States. The Fisher acquired it in 2013 from a collector, somebody who'd been pulling together these materials together over many years probably. And I love the kind of level of human interest and detail that is communicated by a lot of the materials in this collection about a technology that we don't really think about anymore as relevant to our daily life, but that set the precedent for so much of the way that we send and receive information, in the internet age, as you could call it right now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what are some of your favorite items from this collection that you can show us?
Yeah, so I think what I've pulled out are things that kind of illuminate the history of the telegraph, but also illuminate that kind of human connection.
Mm-hmm.
Before I came to the Fisher, you mentioned it's been about a year since I started working here. I was working more in an information technology role, also within the U of T libraries,
Mm-hmm.
and I gained a real appreciation for all of the labor, the hidden labor that underlies information communication technology networks. All the systems and applications and infrastructure that allow us to communicate over the internet, allow us to do the work that we need to do with computers, has a human side to it. And so a lot of these materials just really underlie that, but for a different technology. So we can switch over to kind of the first item that I've pulled out here. The telegraph was invented in the 1830s and 40s. The first telegraphic message was sent in 1844. And it came to Canada not long after. So there was a line that was built between Toronto and Hamilton.
Mm-hmm.
And the first message was sent in it was sent in December 1846. So the telegraph we have here was sent just a few months. This one's March 1847.
Oh, wow.
So it's basically a few months after the line was built.
Mm-hmm.
There's a hilarious anecdote as well, about the construction of that line, where the first messages that were sent and received in December 1846 were the telegraph operators arguing about what time it was, because there was no standardized time at the time, and Toronto and Hamilton differed by 17 minutes.
Oh, that's so
So
interesting.
they were kind of comparing what time it was, and then once they had figured out that detail, they put the mayors on and they exchanged messages.
So admin first.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
But so as you can see, it's March 1847. People are already using it, and of course. It was an relatively expensive technology to make use of initially.
Mm-hmm.
And so, tragic events were most commonly transmitted, right? So this one's
Mm-hmm.
about a death of somebody named Adelaide, although it's good to know that she suffered no pain. And I'll pull out another here. I have a few different examples of kind of early telegraphs. This is another about a death. But it's useful to get a sense. There's the pricing up at the top here. Slightly different prices for 10 words or under based on the location. And extra money for each additional word. So that really led to that, what they call the kind of telegraphic style, terse
Yeah.
kind of communication.
Very difficult to communicate important life events in this sort of language.
Yeah, and so this one is relatively verbose about, again, a death that's occurred. It's interesting at the bottom. It's from somebody named Mr. Jones to another Jones. Must be perhaps a family member. And at the bottom, there's a note from the telegraph operator saying that he better send it to another place because I'm very unwell and fear I may not able to remain in my office much longer.
Oh, wow.
So that kind of, as I said, illustrates there's a human behind, these messages, sending and receiving them.
Mm-hmm.
Telegraph operators had to have the training and ability to receive and transmit messages and be available at all hours.
Mhm.
But that one, as I said, is relatively verbose. We have another here, which is just the most classic, terse telegraph message, which is, "Your mother is dead."
Oh dear.
Which just sounds, I mean, it's sad, but it's also extremely brief.
Yeah, perhaps there wasn't any money for any extra words, I
Yeah,
guess.
that's right.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
That one's from a little bit later, 1862.
Mhm.
Let's see. Here's another from, again, 1864, a little bit more verbose, longer, about someone named Montgomery who sustained a broken leg in a place called Pabas Mills, which is in the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec.
Mhm.
And he wants one of his daughters to come up.
Oh.
So I'm assuming perhaps this
To care for him,
happened,
yeah.
in like a lumber camp or some
Yeah.
sort of work situation. It's being sent by his employer,
Mhm.
I'm guessing. And so, yeah, it's like a little bit more detail there, perhaps because they were willing to pay for it. But of course, the telegraph was very rapidly adopted by people in business. I mean, one of the initial markets was for news agencies sending information, particularly from the States to Canada. And the States had the link through steamship to Europe through New York. And so Canadian news agencies were interested in getting that information very quickly. And of course, it also had political uses as well. This is a telegraph book, essentially. I think you must have been able to buy these sort of bound together. And so if you were a frequent user of the Telegraph, you could fill them out. And so this one was owned by a businessman and kind of promoter, somewhat unscrupulous railway builder guy named Frederick Capriol. And he has messages in here. He would write the one you sent on the left, and then this would be the one that you would.
Sort of,
Yeah, so this one's addressed to Sir Johnny MacDonald,
Oh wow.
1869. Capriol is saying that somebody, I'm guessing named Light, returning to Brunswick, has evidence of great importance to me. Can you extend his leave a few days?
Oh, so important
Some
political
kind of
matters being discussed, or
some sort of
or business.
incident.
Oh, I see.
Who knows? Another is addressed to Sanford Fleming, who was a famous engineer responsible for standardization of time.
Are there any happy messages in any of these?
I mean,
it mostly sort of the distressing moments of life and sort of difficulties?
a lot of the time, or it was used, of course, for business purposes, political purposes. And as the technology improved and the networks improved, and the price came down, there were price wars that were waged between companies. Common people would use it for all sorts of purposes. I like this. This is a little pamphlet here that was put together by the Montreal Telegraph Company's messenger boys. Montreal Telegraph Company was one of the first in Canada and became the dominant company for the telegraph networks for quite a while. And so it's interesting. It's a New Year's address from 1873, published by one of themselves, or written by one of themselves.
Very sweet.
And it's got this sweet little poem inside, versifying their trade, basically. So you'll say, it says, "No matter what the weather, you always find him round. He never spares shoe leather when you are to be found. He's always in a hurry, a perfect little prancer, and it puts him in a flurry if his message brings an answer. You should seen him when Chicago blazed and Boston followed suit, whilst all the world in pity gazed by terror rendered mute. When telegrams like snowflakes fell, the boy, oh, where was he? Old Nick himself could only tell he was busy as a bee."
That's so wonderful.
Yeah, I like the, and it's interesting. It's quite sweet and kind of, it's meant to be kind of cute, I think. But it also underscores some of the work involved, right? Running around, delivering messages.
And during the Christmas season, this would be incentive to maybe give it a little extra to your boy.
And right at the end, it says, "His message now is one of joy. He brings it without fear, and you'll reward the carrier boy for his happy, glad New Year." So yeah, your instinct is right there. And it's interesting, like it alludes to the kind of sometimes the tragic nature of sending, receiving messages during this time, but also, yeah, kind of ends on a positive note.
It sort of softens the work involved and
It
kind of
does.
makes it slightly more palatable and sweet.
Yeah, it's a nice little document for sure. I love this item.
Gorgeous. Yeah.
My favorite item, I think, in all of this, in part because I'm originally from the East Coast, is this letter. It's a little hard to read, so I can like read out notable sections for it. But it's a from July 1856. It's addressed from the Nova Scotia Electric Telegraph Company office in Halifax to a station in Digby, Nova Scotia, which is a couple hours drive today, maybe a bit longer. Then it would have been considerably farther. Digby's located kind of on the other side of Nova Scotia in the Bay of Fundy, famous for its scallops, among other things. And the letter is essentially reprimanding an employee at the Digby office for inattention to duty. It names him a little further on as somebody named Dennison, no first name given. And what's fascinating about it is that it really shows the change of expectations around rapidity of delivery of information. So, prior to the telegraph, if you wanted to deliver information over a large distance, you had a couple options. Like you could use the postal service. You could perhaps hire somebody to deliver for you at a faster rate. There were systems primarily for military use that used like semaphore.
Oh wow.
Or variations on that.
Probably extremely expensive.
Expensive.
Difficult to,
fascinating by themselves.
Yeah.
But the telegraph really changed things completely, where you could send information with remarkable rapidity over a great distance, right? And so, as I said, in Canada, 1846 was when the first messages were sent. This is 1856, 10 years later, and there's a complaint here about messages received in Digby at about 5 o'clock at night, and it wasn't responded to by the operator until 9 o'clock that evening, and wasn't delivered until the next morning. So what's that, like a 4-hour issue of delay?
Yeah.
And the party being spoken of here complains bitterly. Let's see, what's this section? Yes, complains bitterly of the loss he has suffered by the delay, and is very much dissatisfied.
Oh dear.
And says they had to refund the message. Message was not delivered until the morning of the 6th. This message we had to refund, and the party complains bitterly of the loss he suffered by the delay, and is much dissatisfied.
Yes. His laziness.
Yeah.
And inattention to business.
That standard of information delivery would have been unthinkable a few years prior.
Yeah, not too long before. And people quickly became accustomed to this much improved kind of speed of communication.
Yeah, it's an interesting illustration of how technologies can change expectations, can alter behavior. And also the people that were underlying this infrastructure, like who knows what was happening with Dennison in his life at this time.
Yes.
But, working shifts according to set hours was a requirement of this job. Eventually, telegraph operators would unionize, and there was a strike a little bit later, I think in the 1880s, around reducing working hours and improving pay. And so it's interesting here to see an illustration of that. Of course, Dennison has reacted. He made use of impertinent or an improper language, and seemed to think that he was badly treated through some private pique, or for the purpose of annoying him, and not because he deserved censure.
Oh. So he felt
up.
like he was being picked on.
Yeah.
That's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate. However, I
can see why this would be your favorite.
Yeah.
Most of all, it's very clear the people behind it and their strong feelings about everything.
That's right. Yeah, it's a surprisingly honest letter in a way. And as I said, kind of really shows this human aspect. The other piece of it, of course, is the physical part as well, right? Like in order for a telegraph to work, much like the internet today, you had to physically lay out wire, which connected one place to another. That kind of physical infrastructure is only matched by railways, right? Like that, if you think about the amount of effort to move something from one place to another, like a
Yes.
railway
Yeah.
is the other
Mm-hmm.
example. And of course, they were co-determinate, or they were related to one another. You know,
Yeah.
telegraph lines followed the lines of railways.
Mm-hmm.
The railways used telegraphs. Both railways and telegraphs were responsible for standardized time, because as soon as you had things speeding up, it meant needing to coordinate time schedules by something more accurate than the sun. But the real dream, though, in all of this, as this network of telegraphs was building up in North America, was to connect to Europe, and to receive information quickly from the colonial center. Right?
Yeah.
At that time, the only method was steamship. That journey could take like a week to 10 days, as far as I understand. And so speeding that up was a real dream. And so there was a project that was conceived of by a guy named Frederick Gisborne, I'm not sure, and funded by someone named Cyrus Field, who was a millionaire, to lay a telegraph line, basically a transatlantic line. It had been successfully done in the British Channel previously, and I think there were probably experiments or other examples happening elsewhere, but never at such a distance. And so they had to start by connecting the two closest points, right? And so in Canada, we have kind of a special history where Newfoundland is the closest part of Canada's current territory to Europe. Even then, of course, it wasn't part of Canada, but was considered sort of, generally part of this landmass, and eventually would join, of course. And so a company was set up called the New York, Newfoundland, and London Telegraph Company. And the first effort was really to build a telegraph line across Newfoundland, connected to Cape Breton, which was then connected to the rest of the North American network. And so that effort was made in 1855 to 6, after a whole bunch of false starts. And this handbill is advertising for workers to help build a line across Newfoundland.
Wow.
So it says here they're looking for contracts proceeding along the line of the company from St. John's to Cape Ray. And so St. John's being almost on the most eastern side of Newfoundland, Cape Ray being the closest point to Cape Breton. And so the line was really proceeding across Newfoundland, basically. There were lots of issues with this. The Newfoundland soil is very rocky, and it was hard to drive poles into the ground. So it took years.
And then you have a whole season where you're probably not able to work to the same level.
The same degree, right? This is advertising again for people to contribute to this work. It eventually, they eventually hired 600 workers, and it cost about $1 million just to build the Newfoundland section.
Wow.
Which is wild to think about. And this, you can see they're expecting things to be finished at about 1856. I think it took till about the end of 1856, as opposed to like January to March, as they're saying here. And advertising for different people living in different communities who have boats to like go to those places. If you don't have a boat, you can walk to Conn River.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, this is a fascinating little handbill. Again, illustrating the construction work basically that had to happen.
Yeah, I'm just imagining the places where they were staying while they were doing their work, the different probably camps and places that had to be set up in order to accommodate this more than 400 able-bodied men for much longer than 6 weeks.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So when that work was completed across Newfoundland and connecting to Cape Breton, the Cape Breton portion was finished a little earlier in 1855. The Atlantic cable was hooked up at Trinity Bay, Newfoundland, in August 1855. 732 messages were sent between Europe and North America during that time. But there were issues with the cable. It had been poorly constructed. It had to be spliced at a number of points. And then one kind of member of this project the issue was that it was taking a lot of time to get information, basically electricity from one end to the other, because of issues around insulation. And so one project member decided to kind of like juice the line, basically, and just like send like 2,000 volts of electricity through. That compromised the insulation, and basically made the cable unusable. Oh. So it died essentially September 1858, and despite its initial success, right, like it was functional for a period of time, essentially had to be replaced. I will say though that it functioned well enough in order for there to be at least one piece of sheet music published celebrating this grand technological achievement. This is the Ocean Telegraph March, which is from 1858. It's got this great cover here with a portrait of Sears Field, the funder essentially of the project. It has the ships and diagram of the cable.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So at this period, any kind of noteworthy event would probably inspire some kind of march or rag or song.
Yeah, patriotic song. I would love to know what this sounds like. I'm sure it's very triumphant.
Perhaps one of our viewers can come by and play it for us.
Yeah, that would be delighted. It's the sheet music genre, as you say, is like kind of key to this era.
Just a quick peek at the inside.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a musician, so it's kind of like, well, it looks like music to me. So they learned a lot from that first failure in a way, in terms of both the construction of the cable, but also means of laying it. And so there's a ship called the Great Eastern, which was key to the second effort. So it was the largest ship of its time. It was built in 1858 and was only superseded in 1899. I mean, it was refitted specially to lay this cable, starting in 1865. So I have a couple images. This is a small little card, but there's also this beautiful large Currier and Ives print of the ship as well. Boasting about how big it is, basically. And someone pointed out,
specs.
Yeah, it's got all the specs. I love too. It's a hybrid ship. It's steam powered with a paddle wheel, but it's also got sails in case you want to take advantage of the wind. So it's an early kind of hybrid vessel. I'm sure this was more common than you think, but having them both illustrated in this
we don't
kind
see
of cool.
that many depictions of them like that around here.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's in this one. Not really. Kind of. Yeah, you do get a sense of that. So this ship was really kind of key to that second effort, right? And if you think about the prospect of laying an iron and I guess like copper cable, ironclad copper cable across the ocean floor for thousands of miles separating two continents, that's wild to contemplate.
Difficult to imagine.
Yeah, and like no wonder it was challenging, right? And so the Great Eastern was laying the cable in 1865, but it snapped off the back of the ship and was lost.
Oh.
So it's like imagine hauling a rope or something, and you're like pulling really hard, and then it's like, and it slips away into the ocean, right?
And then you have to start again.
Yeah, and then so they started again. So a new cable was laid in July 1866. And was successfully connected at Heart's Content, Newfoundland. So there was great celebration. But what they did, which I think was kind of nice, is went back and tried to find the other piece of the cable. And so we have a really cool item that relates to that history in this collection, which is the signal log for the Great Eastern. This is the book that was kept on ship, recording messages sent to and from the ships that were involved in this recovery effort.
Oh, wow.
So I'm not sure, this was purchased at about the same time as the rest of this collection. And it was a good buy, I would say, whoever made that decision.
Yeah.
Because it's really primary source. Like, it's interesting because they were sending messages to one another, not through Telegraph, of course, but through probably like whatever kind of ship messaging system. Semaphore was in place. But you have somebody responsible on ship for writing these down. And they start the log just after the successful connection of the first cable. So now the plan is to go back and find it. There are a number of other ships involved. They're named here as well. And so these are messages to and from the Great Eastern, sent to the other ships who are participating in this effort. So there were 3 other ships, the Medway, Lily, and Terrible, and then Albany as well. So actually 4 other ships. I think 1 maybe wasn't there the whole time. And let's see. They kept getting it. So the Albany apparently was able to actually dredge up the cable, which is crazy if you think about it in the first place.
Yeah.
They were using a grappling hook and kind of fishing the bottom of the ocean 4 kilometers below the surface.
Amazing that they grabbed anything.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. There's an exclamation here. Hooked
Yeah,
cable.
hooked cable.
Very exciting.
Have you hooked cable? Think so. Heaving up. Have you hooked cable? So there were a number of times when they caught it, it slipped away.
Oh.
It's just like it's like holding Jello or something. It's like and you're like
Really frustrating. This was to recover the
snapped
materials.
one. No,
So
this
they
is
could
to
reuse it.
reconnect it.
Oh, to
So
reconnect
what
it, I see.
happened? That's a great question. So what happened basically was that eventually they were able to retrieve the end, reconnect it. So they spliced it with fresh cable and then brought it to Newfoundland. So at the very end of the signal log, they're steaming into Heart's Content. There's a governor, Mr. Wyatt, of some kind coming on board. We figured out who he is. And they were able to connect a second cable. And so this is also a feature of technological systems that we have in place, which is called redundancy. So you have more than one element of a system to enable its reliability, right? And so that recovery effort and the ability to reconnect the lost cable, in addition to the one that had been laid successfully the second go, I guess, meant that connection could be more and more reliable. And in fact, the improvements between those 2 eras, like the first attempt that failed, meant faster sending and receipt of messages as well. You could send basically 10 words in about a minute between the 2
Pretty good.
continents.
Yeah.
Whereas previously in the 1858 version, it would take 2 minutes to transmit 1 character.
Not ideal.
Not ideal. So, I mean, if we talk about, like, there's that relationship between the, like, physical aspects of how these systems work, the expectations, the desires, all these kind of things build on one another, right? And so by, September 1866, you have this communications network that's starting to look global, right? And then into the late 19th century and early 1900s, it does become a global communications network connecting just about everywhere that you can imagine, really. Only to be superseded very shortly by the telephone, right?
How long was the period around between when the telephone sort of took over?
It wasn't that long. The telephone was invented, in the mid 1800s?
I think
have to
so.
look it up.
Yeah.
And telephone networks were in competition with telegraphic ones. There was sort of a fight.
So they coexisted for a period.
They did, yeah. And were used presumably for different purposes. I think telephone networks were probably similar to telegraph networks in their infancy, in that they were expensive, difficult to use, not as accessible, and then became increasingly accessible. But in all of these things, and I think in particular the telegraphic networks, it really set the stage for telecommunications networks that we know today. There are still hundreds, probably thousands of undersea cables that connect us. There's a fiber optic cable between Europe and North America that sends information that makes the internet work. Or rather, it allows us to communicate with countries that are not in North America at the speed of light, right? I was saying to Liz earlier, I was doing a lot of fact finding on this history and learning about the ocean floor fiber optic cable. There was one that was installed in 1988, and its primary issue wasn't currents or anything like that. It was shark attacks, because There's some theory that sharks are perhaps more sensitive to magnetic pulses or electricity, and so there was maybe some issue there. So the sharks were attacking the cable.
That's amazing.
But improvements in design have meant that sharks are less inclined to disrupt the internet. So that's great. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this little tour through this collection of telegraphic materials. As I said, I think these primary sources have a really unique way of connecting us with the individual stories of communications technology, which can be kind of like, can be sort of dry when you hear about, oh, it's the telegraph, it's like Morse code. But if you think about its construction across Canada, it's used by individual people to communicate news of importance to one another. And the physical labor and effort that went into not only making those networks but sustaining them. I think there's so many interesting stories to be told there, and it's just a delight to come across a collection like this that really provides that in such a distilled way.
We do a lot of teaching around sort of how people used to communicate in the past, and the difficulty of finding your communities and the difficulty of sharing information and how valuable information was. And I think this collection will be amazing for use in teaching in those kinds of themes.
Great, I'm glad to hear it. Yeah,
Well, thank you for sharing it with us today.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks for having me on Between the Pillars again. It's great to be back and celebrate almost a year at the Fisher.
Yes. Thank you very much for joining us for this week's Between the Pillars, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.